When a dying husky lay abandoned in the snow, freezing at -30 degrees, car after car passed without stopping. But then, headlights pierced the blizzard, and a black car screeched to a halt. The door opened, and out stepped Keanu Reeves. What began as a routine drive through the mountains would soon turn into a race against time. A battle for survival that neither man nor dog would ever forget. The wind howled through the darkness, sweeping icy shards of snow across the deserted highway. The air was thick with cold, a biting chill that seemed to pierce through the very soul. A lone husky collapsed in the snow, his body trembling violently from the -30-degree cold. His once thick coat was now thin and matted, his ribs pressing against his fragile skin. Every breath he took was shallow, frost forming around his nose. He had been waiting for anyone, to stop, but no one did. His vision blurred, his strength fading. Just as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, a sleek black car suddenly screeched to a halt. The door swung open, and a shadowy figure stepped out, clad in a long black coat, his breath visible in the freezing air. He moved with quiet determination, his sharp eyes locked onto the motionless dog. Keanu Reeves had just found him, and in that moment, everything changed. Keanu knelt beside the husky, his fingers brushing against the snow-dusted fur. The dog barely stirred. His body was ice-cold, his breathing faint. He was hanging on by a thread. Without hesitation, Keanu shed his coat, wrapping it around the frail creature before lifting him into his arms. The weight was alarmingly light, too light for a dog of his size. He rushed back to the warmth of his car, carefully placing the husky on the heated seat beside him. "Hold on, buddy," Keanu murmured as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight with determination. He knew he didn't have much time. He had lost too much in his life already. He wasn't about to lose this dog too. The drive through the snowstorm was treacherous, but Keanu didn't slow down. His focus remained on the fragile creature beside him, watching the shallow rise and fall of the husky's chest. The warmth of the car had started to work its magic, but it wasn't enough. He needed to get help, and fast. As the storm raged outside, Keanu Reeves was racing against time, determined to give this abandoned soul a second chance at life. The storm raged on, thick snow swirling in the headlights as Keanu Reeves gripped the wheel, his jaw set with determination. The husky beside him remained still, his fragile body curled weakly on the heated seat. Keanu reached over for a brief second, resting a hand on the frail dog's head. It was ice cold. He pressed his foot against the gas pedal. He had to move faster. The mountain roads were treacherous, but Keanu had driven them countless times before. This wasn't just any drive. This was a race against time, a battle between life and the relentless grip of the cold. Every second mattered. Every moment was a silent prayer that the dog beside him would keep breathing. As the car plowed through the snow, his thoughts drifted back to a time when he had held another life in his hands, only to watch it slip away. Not again. He wasn't going to let this dog die tonight. The husky let out a faint whimper, barely audible over the roar of the wind. It was the smallest sound, but it was enough. Keanu glanced at him, gripping the wheel tighter. "Stay with me, buddy. Just a little longer." Now, before I share what happens next, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever felt that special connection with an animal, one that goes beyond words, hit that like button. Because what happens next might just make you believe in miracles. At last, a faint glow pierced through the darkness. The lights of a small veterinary clinic nestled at the edge of town. Keanu didn't hesitate. He pulled into the lot, tires skidding slightly against the ice. Before the engine had even stopped, he threw the door open and scooped the husky into his arms, cradling him against his chest. The clinic's doors burst open as he stepped inside, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the deadly cold outside. A woman in a white coat rushed toward him, her eyes widening as she took in the half-frozen animal in his arms. "Please," Keanu said, his voice steady but urgent. "Help him." The vet, Dr. Lila Monroe, wasted no time. She gestured toward the examination table. Lay him down here. Let's get him warmed up and check his vitals. Keanu carefully placed the Husky onto the table, watching as the team moved into action. Warm blankets, for fluids, a heat lamp. Every step felt agonizingly slow, but he knew they were doing everything they could. The Husky, once trembling on the verge of death, let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh as the warmth began to seep back into his body. Dr. Monroe looked up. You got him here just in time. A few more minutes in that cold, and he wouldn't have made it. Keanu exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time that night. He leaned against the wall, watching as the dog fought his way back to life. He was out there all alone, Keanu murmured. No collar, no tags. Just waiting. Dr. Monroe nodded, her expression softening. It happens more than you'd think. But this one, he's lucky. Not every dog gets a second chance. Keanu's gaze remained on the Husky. He had always believed in fate, in the idea that some moments in life weren't accidents but callings. This was one of them. As the hours passed, the Husky's breathing grew stronger. Keanu stayed by his side, one hand resting lightly on the dog's paw, anchoring him to the present. For the first time in hours, the storm outside didn't seem so overwhelming. And in that quiet moment, a bond was formed, one that neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed. What happens next will make your heart melt. But tell me, have you ever rescued an animal in need? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget, if this moment touched your heart, hit that like button. Because this is just the beginning. The first rays of morning light seeped through the clinic windows, casting a soft golden hue over the quiet room. Keanu sat motionless beside the examination table, his fingers lightly resting on the Husky's paw. The rhythmic sound of the four drip filled the silence, each drop marking another second that the dog was still fighting. The night had been long, but the worst was over. The Husky had made it through. Dr. Monroe approached, clipboard in hand, her expression softer than before. His body temperature is stabilizing and he's responding well to the fluids, she said. It'll take some time, but with proper care, he has a real chance. Keanu nodded, his gaze never leaving the dog. The frail creature that had once been barely clinging to life now looked just a little stronger. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and though his eyes remained closed, there was no longer that haunting stillness to him. Keanu exhaled, only now realizing how long he had been holding his breath. What happens next? He asked. Dr. Monroe hesitated. He'll need a few days here for observation. After that, well, he'll need a home. The words lingered in the air. Keanu already knew where this was going. He could feel the weight of the decision settling over him, but deep down he had already made his choice. He glanced at the dog, remembering the way he had collapsed in the snow, the way he had barely clung to life. Abandoned, unwanted, left to freeze. Dr. Monroe must have noticed something in his expression because she smiled knowingly. You don't have to decide now, she said gently. Just think about it. But Keanu wasn't thinking. He already knew. Days passed, and with each visit, the Husky, now clean, warm, and no longer just a shell of himself, grew stronger. He started lifting his head when Keanu entered the room, his ears perking up at the sound of his voice. The first time he tried to stand, his legs wobbled and he nearly collapsed. But Keanu was there, steadying him, whispering words of quiet encouragement. You're tougher than you look, he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. The bond between them grew in silence, in shared moments of understanding. There was something unspoken but deeply felt, as if they both knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. On the fifth day, when Keanu arrived, the Husky was already waiting for him, his tail, though still weak, thumping lightly against the blankets. Dr. Monroe watched from a distance, a knowing smile on her face. I think he's made his decision, she said. Keanu crouched down, holding out a hand. The Husky hesitated for only a second before nudging it with his nose, pressing his head against Keanu's palm. Yeah, Keanu said softly, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I guess I have too. By the time the paperwork was signed, the Husky had a name. Ghost. A fitting name for a dog who had once been nothing more than a shadow in the snow. As they stepped out of the clinic together, the winter air was still sharp, but this time it no longer felt so cold. Ghost hesitated at the threshold, taking in his new reality. Keanu waited patiently, allowing him to decide on his own. And then, with a quiet resolve, the Husky took his first steps into his new life, trotting beside the man who had saved him. The storm had passed. For both of them, a new journey had just begun. The road stretched ahead, winding through the snow-covered landscape as Keanu drove in silence, glancing at Ghost curled up on the passenger seat beside him. The Husky had settled into the warmth of the car, his body still weak but no longer trembling from the cold. Every now and then his ears twitched at the sound of the engine, but his eyes remained heavy with exhaustion. Keanu kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on Ghost's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It was a quiet reassurance that the dog was safe now. As the city lights faded behind them, Keanu took a familiar turn off the main road, heading toward the solitude of his mountain home. The drive was one he had taken countless times before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight he wasn't alone. By the time they reached the secluded cabin, the snow had slowed to a gentle fall, blanketing the world in quiet stillness. Keanu parked the car and stepped out, the cold biting against his skin, but inside, the house was warm. He turned back to Ghost, who was still curled up, reluctant to move. "Come on, buddy," Keanu said softly, reaching over to unbuckle the makeshift blanket he had wrapped around him. "This is home now." Ghost hesitated for a moment, sniffing the air as if trying to make sense of this new place. Then, with a quiet huff, he slowly stepped down onto the snow-covered ground, his paws sinking slightly before he found his balance. He took a few cautious steps, his nose twitching as he picked up new scents: wood, pine, the faint trace of embers still smoldering in the fireplace. Keanu left the door open as he walked inside, giving Ghost the space to decide. It took only a few moments before the Husky followed, his movements careful but steady. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them both, melting away the last remnants of the brutal night. Ghost sniffed around the wooden floors, his gaze flickering toward the fireplace where the fire crackled softly. Keanu watched as the dog slowly lowered himself onto the rug in front of it, sighing as the heat seeped into his tired bones. "You like that, huh?" Keanu muttered, a small smile forming as he shrugged off his coat and tossed it over the chair. He moved toward the kitchen, filling a bowl with fresh water and setting it down near Ghost, then reached for a bag of food, scooping out a generous portion. Ghost lifted his head at the sound, his nose twitching as the scent of food reached him. He hesitated at first, his instincts still wary, but hunger eventually won over. Slowly, he pushed himself up and padded toward the bowl, taking his first careful bites. Keanu leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him. It was the first time he had seen Ghost eat properly. For a long while, they simply existed in the quiet warmth of the cabin. Keanu stoked the fire, adding another log, while Ghost finished his meal and curled up near the flames once more. The weight of exhaustion still clung to both of them, but this time, it was the kind that came with relief, not fear. As the night deepened, Keanu sat down on the couch, stretching his legs in front of him. Ghost lifted his head slightly, eyes drowsy but still watchful. Keanu patted the space beside him. "You're good right there," he murmured. "But you're welcome up here if you want." For a few seconds, Ghost remained still, as if debating whether to take the offer. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he rose to his feet, walked toward the couch, and settled down beside Keanu, his head resting near his leg. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He reached down, running his fingers through the thick fur that had once been ice-cold and brittle but was now warm and full of life. "You're safe now," he whispered. Ghost didn't move, but his body relaxed against him, his breathing slow and steady. The fire crackled softly, casting a golden glow around the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time in a long time, neither of them had to face the cold alone. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's large windows, casting long shadows over the wooden floor. Keanu stretched, his muscles slightly sore from sleeping on the couch. Beside him, Ghost stirred, his ears twitching as he slowly opened his eyes. The night had been peaceful, the first true rest either of them had in a long time. Keanu ran a hand through his hair and glanced down at Ghost, who was already watching him, his icy blue eyes filled with quiet curiosity. It was strange. After everything, after the brutal cold, the fight for survival, the uncertainty, this moment felt natural, like they had always belonged in the same space. "Hungry?" Keanu asked, standing up. Ghost's tail thumped lightly against the couch, his silent answer enough to make Keanu chuckle. He moved to the kitchen, pouring food into a bowl and setting it down before grabbing a quick coffee for himself. Ghost approached cautiously, but this time, There was no hesitation. He trusted the food would be there. He trusted Keanu. The morning passed slowly, the peaceful kind of quiet that only existed in the mountains. Outside, the snowfall had stopped, leaving behind a thick blanket of white that stretched across the landscape. The world felt still, untouched, waiting. Keanu zipped up his jacket and pulled on his gloves. "All right, buddy. Let's see if you're up for some fresh air." Ghost lifted his head at the sound of the door opening. He hesitated only for a moment before trotting after Keanu, his paws pressing into the untouched snow. The cold was sharp, but it no longer held the same deadly edge as it had the night they met. Keanu led them through a familiar trail behind the cabin, his boots crunching against the ice. Ghost stayed close, his steps tentative at first, as if testing this new world. But then, something shifted. His nose twitched, his ears perked up, and suddenly he was moving faster, his body awakening with old instincts. Keanu watched as Ghost darted ahead, sniffing at trees, bounding through the deep snow, his tail wagging high. It was the first time he had seen the Husky truly move, not out of fear, not out of desperation, but simply because he could. He smiled to himself. That's more like it. The two of them wandered deeper into the forest, Ghost never straying too far, always circling back to Keanu. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, but there was an undeniable stillness around them, a silence too thick, too unnatural. Ghost was the first to notice. His body tensed, his ears standing tall as he froze in place. His gaze locked onto something in the distance, something Keanu couldn't yet see. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Keanu stopped walking. His instincts sharpened. He knew that kind of growl, a warning. He followed Ghost's gaze to the ridge just beyond the trees. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow against the snow. But then it moved, a shape, large and powerful, emerging from the cover of the trees. A wolf. No, 3 wolves. Keanu exhaled slowly, his mind racing through options. Wolves were cautious creatures, but winter made them desperate. The lead wolf, a massive gray beast with piercing yellow eyes, stepped forward, his head low, his movements calculated. The other 2 flanked him, their bodies tense, waiting. Ghost didn't back down. He stood firm, his fur bristling, his stance solid despite the obvious disadvantage. He was smaller, weaker, still recovering from his own battle against nature. But none of that mattered. He wasn't running. Keanu clenched his fists. "Easy," he murmured, more to himself than to Ghost. The lead wolf let out a deep, guttural snarl, testing them, gauging their reaction. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only existed in the raw moments between predator and prey. Then, in a blur of movement, the wolf lunged. Ghost reacted instantly, not running, not flinching, but standing his ground. His own growl tore through the air, a sound so fierce and unrelenting that it startled the attacking wolf mid-leap. Keanu moved without thinking. He grabbed a thick branch from the ground and stepped forward, placing himself between Ghost and the wolves. His presence alone wasn't enough to scare them, but he wasn't about to let this turn into a fight. For a long, breathless moment, everything stood still. The wolves watched them. Ghost stared back, unwavering, his breath heavy but his resolve unshaken. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the lead wolf let out a sharp huff, signaling the others. A test. A challenge. They weren't worth the risk. One by one, the wolves backed away, disappearing into the forest like ghosts. The tension shattered, leaving only the sound of Keanu's breath and Ghost's steady panting. Keanu exhaled, lowering the branch. He turned to Ghost, who was still standing firm, still holding his ground. A slow smile spread across Keanu's face. "You really don't back down, do you?" Ghost looked up at him, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. Keanu let out a breathless chuckle. "All right, tough guy. Let's go home." As they walked back toward the cabin, something had changed between them. Not just trust, not just companionship. They had faced something together and won. Ghost was no longer just a dog who had been abandoned in the snow. He was a survivor, a fighter, And now he had a pack. The walk back to the cabin was different. The air felt lighter, the silence no longer heavy with uncertainty, but filled with an unspoken understanding. Keanu glanced down at Ghost, who padded alongside him, his steps steady, his ears alert. The Husky had proven something to both of them today. He was more than a survivor. He was a fighter. By the time they reached the front porch, the warmth of home was already waiting. Keanu opened the door, stepping inside first, but Ghost hesitated. He stood at the threshold, looking in as if still processing what this place meant. Keanu didn't rush him. Instead, he stepped aside and simply waited. A few seconds passed before Ghost took a deep breath and crossed the threshold, stepping fully inside. He wasn't just entering a house, he was accepting it as home. Keanu closed the door behind them and tossed his gloves onto the counter. He stoked the fire, letting the flames grow until the warmth filled every corner of the room. Ghost curled up near the hearth, his body finally relaxing, his head resting on his paws. The exhaustion from the day's events was catching up with him, but for the first time, there was peace in his posture, not tension. Keanu sat down on the couch, stretching out as he watched the flames dance. His gaze flickered to Ghost, then back to the fire. "You did good today," he murmured. "Real good." Ghost's tail gave a single slow wag in response, but he didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. The understanding was already there. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm, a new kind of normal. Mornings started with long walks through the snow-covered forest, Ghost always leading the way but never straying too far. He grew stronger with each passing day, his body filling out, his fur regaining its full luster. The scars of his past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined him. Keanu watched the transformation happen before his eyes. Ghost wasn't just recovering, he was thriving. But something else was happening, too. Keanu had lived in solitude for so long that he had almost forgotten what it meant to share a space, to wake up and have someone there waiting. He had built this quiet life for himself, convinced that it was enough. But now, as he moved through the days with Ghost at his side, he realized just how much he had been missing. One afternoon, Keanu was chopping wood outside when he felt a presence behind him. He turned to see Ghost watching him, head tilted slightly. "You just gonna supervise?" Keanu smirked, tossing another log onto the growing pile. Ghost took a few steps closer, sniffed at the wood, then, without warning, grabbed a small log in his mouth and trotted off with it. Keanu blinked, then let out a laugh. "Oh, so that's how it is?" Ghost dropped the log near the porch, wagging his tail proudly before returning for another. Keanu shook his head, still grinning. All right, I guess we're doing this together." And just like that, another piece of his quiet, solitary life shifted. One more wall breaking down, one more space filled. As the days grew longer and winter began to ease its grip, Keanu and Ghost settled into something that felt permanent. The bond they had formed wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about belonging. One evening, Keanu sat on the porch, watching the last traces of sunlight dip below the trees. Ghost sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "You know," Keanu said, breaking the silence, "I never planned for this." Ghost turned his head slightly, listening. But maybe Keanu exhaled, his gaze still on the horizon. Maybe it was supposed to happen. Ghost let out a soft sigh, resting his head against Keanu's leg. For the first time in a long time, Keanu felt something settle inside him, something that had been missing for too long. This wasn't just a new chapter. This was home. And neither of them would ever be alone again. Now that you've reached the end of this incredible journey, I want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Did Ghost's transformation and his unbreakable bond with Keanu Reeves touch your heart? Let me know in the comments, write down your thoughts, or if you're short on time, drop a 2 if you loved the story, or a 7 if it didn't quite hit the mark for you. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of second chances and the deep connection between humans and animals, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's spread this message of hope together. For more incredible stories like this, subscribe to Tapestry of Worlds and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that will inspire, move, and maybe even change the way you see the world. Your support means everything. Let's keep telling stories that matter.